This is a deck profile on Qliphort Vernusylph, a combination of a pretty old deck and a brand new one, whose game plan is mostly to just annoy the two main decks of the format, because of some of the interesting effects of Qliphorts that have aged pretty well for this format in particular. Now to start off with, as you'd expect, there are the Qliphort cards, which make up the majority of the deck. Starting off with a Qliphort Towers, the most iconic Qliphort card probably, which cannot be special summoned and needs 3 Qlis as tribute material specifically, and when its normal summoner set, it's immune to all spell traps, and by any monster with a lower level rank. As well, it debuffs all special summon monsters by 500 attack and defense, and can rip a card from hand or field each turn. Now this is not only a pretty decent effect, but ended up being outdated after cards like Nightmare Phoenix got released, because you can just summon that. The reason why I bring this up is because in this format, cards like that are being run a lot less, because of Sprights summoning restrictions and Tier Element decks usually just being fusion based. And those two decks in particular can be pretty annoyed by towers, especially in the case of Sprite, because even if they get a gigantic Sprite to 3200, towers will reduce it to 2700 attack, which means they have to resort to a Cat Shark, or they can often run Unicorn along with IP, but this is a weird line of play that not every hand for Sprites can make. And as for the Qliphort engine to allow you to summon towers, we have 3 Qliphort Scout, which is by far the most powerful card in the archetype. It shares a pendulum effect that all Qlis have, which is that you can only special summon Qli monsters. Now Scout's effect is that, soft once per turn, pay 800, search any Qli card from your deck, except for Scout. And that soft once per turn is pretty relevant, but most importantly this card gets your entire engine going, and is basically the backbone of the deck having any viability. And thankfully it's pretty easy to get a hold of. Next is 3 Qliphort Monolith, which during end phase, if you tribute summoned, allows you to draw cards equal to the number of Qli monsters you tributed. So, as you can imagine, if you summon something like Towers, you can draw 3 in the end phase, and this is great for a pendulum deck to help it keep from bleeding advantage as the game goes on. Next up are the high-level 2 tribute Qliphorts, who all share the effect of being able to normal summon without tributing, and if they are normal summoned without tributing, they become level 4, and attack becomes 1800, and this happens as well when they're special summoned. And it's an effect that all effect Qliphorts have. If it is normal summoned, it is immune to activated effects of any monsters whose original level or rank is lower than this card's current level. Which, I'm sure you'll note, 4 is higher than 2, which is part of the idea of its deck, as Sprites will really have a rough time with this. Now, when they should be summoning using at least 1 Qli monster, but not requiring all Qlis, they gain an effect. Stealth can bounce any card on the field to the hand, and your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to this. This is a very good removal effect, as not only can you remove a lot from your opponent's field without them being able to stop it, this also lets you bounce a Scout to your hand. This is relevant because this lets you search more cards. Next up is 3 Qliphort Shell. Qliphort Shell's effect is when it's tribute summoned using Qli, it can make a second attack during each battle phase, and if it attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing damage to your opponent. Now, this is a very good effect for a deck that can definitely struggle having offensive pressure. And I choose to run 3 of this because of that, because putting on pressure with this deck can be difficult sometimes. Next, the one of Qliphort Disc. This card's effect is when it's tribute summoned by using a Qli monster, you can special summon 2 Qli monsters from your deck, but destroy them during the end phase. This card is very versatile and has quite a few effects, but I'm running it at 1 because it's not quite as commonly applicable as the other 2. One case, and the most obvious usage, is to summon 2 Qlis to make their Link monster, and in certain combo lines this can be amazing. The other situation is to summon 2 Qlis to get big beaters on the field to go through a kill or rip apart a board, as there's no restriction on what they can do when they hit the field. In general, this card is pretty useful at certain times, which is why it's at 1, because this deck can search basically any part of its engine at any time. Next up are the 1 tribute monsters, who are very similar. Qliphort Helix, when it is tributed, can destroy a spell trap card in the field. This is mostly for moving opponents back row, but you can also use this to destroy scouts and activate another one if you have one in your hand to get more in your extra deck. Qliphort Carrier returns a monster on the field to the hand, and this is also pretty useful for removing opponents' cards. Or, once again, if you pendulum summon a scout, you can return it to the hand and activate it. These are the cards that you may most commonly tribute summon, or using as tribute summon fodder for the larger ones, and even tribute summoning these can be pretty good. Next up is 3 copies of Sacrifice, the equip spell, which can only be equipped to a Qli, and they gain 300 attack and cannot be destroyed in battle. They can also become 2 tributes for a Qli monster. And if this card is sent from the field to the grave, you can search any Qli monster in your deck. This card is incredibly strong provided you have the right setup, because not only can it turn any given Qliphort into a 2 tribute fodder for large monsters, or make it so 2 Qliphorts can be used as tribute fodder for towers, it also floats, allowing you to search a Qli monster, and this can even be if you equip this to take advantage of its attack boost and battle protection. If that monster is removed from the field, this still searches. It doesn't have to search on tribute summon. And the battle destruction immunity can be pretty useful as well. As you can imagine, you can equip this to a, let's say, a shell on the field that's been tribute summoned, so if your opponent tries to punch over it with a gigantic sprite or something like that, they can't. Next up is 3 Summoner's Art, which searches a level 5 or higher normal monster from deck to your hand. And well, this can fetch either Scout or Monolith, most commonly Scout. It's just a nice consistency boosting card. Then the obligatory POTE tax, 3 Dark Rune or more, your main game plan for going second. Now here's things get interesting with the Vernusylph engine, which is, historically wasn't played of Qliphorts because it came out 2 days ago. Starting off with 3 copies of Vernusylph of the Thawing Mountains. This card is the most useful for Qliphort specifically, and that is because it basically turns any given Qliphort into Cyber Dragon. Its effect is that you can discard this card and any other monster in your hand to then draw 1 card and special summon an Earth monster to your graveyard, locking you into only Earth monster effects. For the most part, this is not relevant. Qliphorts already lock themselves into themselves anyways. The most common way to use this is to, say, discard something like a Helix or Carrier, and then summon it back immediately and draw 1 card. Now this can help getting tribute fodder before you use your pendulum summon, or get up Genius before you use your pendulum summon, both which will help speed up the deck a lot. And the extra draw can help to draw into more Qlis or to draw into more Floodgates. It's a very versatile card, and definitely the best for this deck specifically of the Vernusylphs. Next up, probably the weakest of the Vernusylphs for this deck, Flowing Fields. This card, you can discard it and any other monster to add an Earth monster from your graveyard to your hand, and then special summon an Earth monster from your graveyard. Now, as you imagine, for a Pendulum deck, you often won't have Earth monsters in your graveyard, and this is mostly relevant if you want to recycle, say, a Towers, or a monster you either discarded earlier and didn't summon for another Vernusylph effect, or if you go up against something like Punk, who summon the Zombie Vampire and mill your deck. It's a niche card that you won't always use, but it's nice to have. It's the most cuttable of the Vernusylphs. Next is Vernusylph of the Awakening Forests, which allows you to discard this card and any other monster to send an Earth monster that can be normal summoned or set from your deck to the grave, then special summon an Earth monster from your graveyard with a different name. This is good for cycling through different Qlis, especially in tandem with cards like Fields. This card is decent, but it's of course at 1 because it's not essential. Next is Flourishing Hills, which can discard itself and another monster to search any other Vernusylph. And it's definitely a good effect. I'm not running it at 3 just because if you do this too much you can bleed too much advantage, but this is nice if you need any other Vernusylph, you can just use this. And all the Vernusylphs do have effects that buff themselves, but that's not really relevant because they will almost never hit the field. Next, because this is Qliphort from our day, the obligatory Floodgates. Now, Skill Drain is a strong card, it negates all effects, but it's especially powerful in Qliphort as it actually buffs yourself. Because, even though normal or special summon Qlis become level 4 and lose their attack, if their effects are negated, they go back. So if you have a Skill Drain, these all become their maximum stats. This can be very useful if you can get several of them on the field very quickly. You can pretty quickly put a ton of damage on board and make a huge problem for your opponent. Then, Rivalry of Warlords. Each player can only control one type of monster. In this deck, where you'll only be controlling Qlis, it doesn't affect you, but it affects a lot of other decks in the metagame. This is definitely a flex spot. This is just my preference for Floodgate for this deck specifically. And the extra deck is not especially necessary outside of at least having Genius, the main Link monster, which requires 2 machine monsters, is a Link 2, and it's unaffected by spell trap effects and Link monsters' activated effects. This is obviously made to give the deck some kind of game against Links. Now once per turn, you can negate a face-up card on each player's field, which is pretty decent, but the real powerful effect is when 2 monsters are special summoned at the same time to the zones this card points to, you can add a level 5 or higher machine from your deck to your hand. This allows you to search any Qli. And this card is a lot easier to make now, early on, thanks to the Vernusylphs, so it is very strong. The rest of the extra deck is basically just super poly targets and flex cards. The super poly targets that are just standard for this format, and you almost never summon any of these, they just here to fill up space and for extreme corner cases. And of course, the side deck is not super definitive, but these are just cards you could expect to see. Super Poly is obvious. Mystic Might is especially good with this deck, as this deck is very comfortable with sitting behind one single monster for a while, and so it's quite strong. It's a card to slow down games for a pretty slow deck. Another interesting card with this deck is Necro Valley, which, for Pyrocles, doesn't affect it at all, and can devastate the opponent. But it does completely turn off Vernusylphs, and so I'm siding this in case you're against something like Tier Element, where you'll just side out the Vernusylphs for this and you know you're going first. And then Lightning Storm and Dimensional Barrier are just generic side deck cards. Now, as for what Qlis can do with their new support, well, this is a replay of a pretty good hand all things considered, consisting of 1 Helix, 2 Sacrifice, 1 Scout, and 1 Thawing Mountains. Now at the start, we'll use Thawing Mountains to discard a Self and Helix to draw a Carrier. Next, we'll special summon Helix, this puts 1 monster on the field. The next step is to activate Scout. Using Scout, pay 800, and then I will search Disc. Then after this, I can use Sacrifice, equipping it to Helix. This turns Helix into a 2 tribute monster. Such, I will normal summon Disc. Afterwards, I will activate Disc, and then chain Sacrifice's Chain Link 2. Using Sacrifice, I will search Monolith. Realistically, it could be any low skill, either early on, and then summon Helix and Carrier. Using these two, I'll activate Monolith first, but that's not necessary. I will link into Qliphort Genius. As you can see, I have made Genius before using my Pendulum Summon. Afterwards, I can go ahead and Pendulum Summon using 2 monsters from the extra deck to these zones that Genius points to search an extra Earth monster. At this point, I will go ahead and equip Sacrifice to Disc to give it more protection. And of course with this I could have summoned Carrier, but in this case I would hold it just in case the board got hit very hard. And as for what this board does, it doesn't interrupt the opponent at all, but Genius is immune to spell traps and link effects. Disc is immune to monsters who are level 6 or lower, has 3100 attack and cannot be destroyed by battle. As well, if it's removed, Sacrifice will float into another Qli monster. These two Qliphorts have no real protection, but they are there, they exist. What this also means is on the next turn I can search more cards, and maybe even some more towers or shell and begin drawing cards. Now as for a hand that can make towers turn 1, this is another pretty decent one, consisting of Qliphort Shell, Scout, Carrier, as well as Sacrifice, and Flourishing Hills. The first step being to activate Flourishing Hills, discarding Carrier, to search Thawing Mountains. See, summoning Carrier back. Next, I go ahead and activate Scout, using Scout's effect, pay 800, and then search Helix. Afterwards, I can go ahead and activate Thawing Mountains, discarding Helix, to draw 1 and summon Helix back. I can then go ahead and link into Qliphort Genius. Afterwards, I will scale up Qliphort Disc. Afterwards, I will go ahead and Pendulum Summon the 2 monsters I sent to the extra deck, Helix and Carrier. This triggers Genius, allowing me to go ahead and search towers. Next, I will activate Sacrifice, equipping it to a Qli, to turn it into 2 tributes. Afterwards, I will tribute these 2 for towers, summoning it, and then triggering Sacrifice to search another Earth machine. In this case, just searching another Scout. Now, as for what this board does, it still has a Genius who's immune, as well as towers. And of course, on the follow-up turn, I will be able to, if Genius lives, pen 2, tribute Shell, and even if not, I can use Scout to recur more cards, and eventually summon Shell to start getting in for more damage. And, well, Towers is pretty hard to get rid of this format, and so this card's pretty likely to remain, and even if it doesn't, your opponent probably had to spend a lot of resources getting rid of it. Of course, because I'm not running many Vernusylphs, you won't always draw into them, but they're not necessary to make pretty impressive plays. Now in this replay, I go ahead and activate Summoner's Art to grab Scout. Afterwards, activate Scout, and after I've activated Scout, I will go ahead and search Sacrifice. Next, I can go and scale Monolith, and Pendulum Summon Shell. Then equip Shell with Sacrifice, and tribute over with Stealth, using Stealth's effect to bounce Qliphort Scout back to the hand and chain them to Sacrifice. No, I did not place optimally. Optimally, you would Sacrifice Chainlink 1 and chain block it with Stealth to prevent cards like Ash Blossom from going through if they hadn't Ash Blossomed the Scout. Of course, I will search Qliphort Carrier and then use Stealth to bounce Scout. Afterwards, I can scale Scout again and activate its effect yet again, searching Sacrifice. I can equip this to the Stealth to give it protection, and then set Skill Drain. Now this end board, of course, has Skill Drain, and as well a 3100 attack monster, and when Skill Drain's flipped, it won't have its protection, but it will have 3100 attack and battle immunity, which is a very big problem under Skill Drain, and even if they get rid of it, once again, Sacrifice floats into another Qliphort card. Now, of course, like all Pendulum decks, if Qliphort doesn't draw a critical mass, Pendulum monsters, they can't do so much, especially not in a combo way. And you might expect, well, that's a big weakness. But out of all Pendulum decks, Qliphort's the most prepared, generally, to deal with that. Because, simply, if you draw a hand like this of 2 Rivalry, Skill Drain, Dark Ruler, and Carrier, which is just Floodgates and a single Pendulum, you can normal summon Carrier, then set Rivalry, and Skill Drain. And this end board is of course Skill Drain, which will turn Carrier to a 2400 attack monster, which is annoying to get rid of under Skill Drain, and Rivalry Warlords will restrict what your opponent can summon. And this board is generally good enough to slow the game down enough for you to eventually draw into more Qliphort cards and get your engine going. Because Qliphort is pretty prepared to go into a very slow game, especially when backed up by one of these floodgates. So, in conclusion, while this deck is definitely not going to start topping YCS's anytime soon, it is an interesting pick for something like a low-level locals in this current format, because the 2 best decks do have some struggles dealing with this deck. Qliphort are all level 2 and rank 2s with a handful of link 2s, but they have to specifically be running the removal ones to deal with a lot of these cards. If their backbone removal is in their main and an extra deck of Xyz monsters, then it's going to be a real problem to deal with these high stat, high level monsters that are immune to their cards. Now as for Tier Element, well, its endboard of Winda doesn't do much against a deck that's very comfortable of just normal summoning a big monster and passing, and even its negation, like the Predaplane Tracepelia, doesn't do a whole lot, because not only with some Qliphorts, if you try and negate them, they'll just keep their attack quite high. It can't respond to Stealth, which might remove it, which is a very big problem, but Stealth and Shell, and even Disc, are all big enough to punch over it. So, that doesn't do much good, and even then, Carrier can just return it to the hand. And as you can imagine, it doesn't do much good against towers. And so most of the Tier Element deck can definitely struggle. And both decks' endboards are definitely messed up by Rivalry. Sprights will be unable to go for the Toad line, and Tier Elements uses a lot of different archetypes and types. This deck's main weakness, of course, is going second. You rely on cards like Darkroom Amour or Mystic Mine to actually break the very heavy boards in this format, as generally normal summoning a Carrier and hoping that attack goes through is not going to do much to your opponent. And while the Vernusylph speed up the deck a ton, they also lose a ton of cards in your hand, so if they get negated, you're going to have a rough time. The deck is also pretty bricky, even if it draws floodgates, and there are scenarios where you can just draw maybe a single Vernusylph and then a bunch of spell traps that don't do anything, although that is very rare. Generally the deck is not the best ever, but it is at least unique and fun, and it uses some of the new cards, and I'm sure this deck list can be improved upon.